Rewind. Chapter 1. The Attic Speaks. I want to be clear about something. I did not go up into the attic to find myself. I went up to find the label maker. It was a Tuesday, which is already a suspicious day for life-altering events, because Tuesdays have no drama budget. My name is Margaret. Maggie Callahan. I am 55 years old, I have a mortgage that makes me wince, a job in corporate HR that makes me weep, and a cat named Leonard who has never once acknowledged my existence. I mention Leonard because he is, in many ways, the emotional barometer of my life. When Leonard ignores me, things are normal. When Leonard actually looks at me, something has gone terribly wrong. On this particular Tuesday, Leonard looked at me. I was standing on the pull-down attic stairs, one foot on the bottom rung, the other still planted on the hallway carpet, when he sat at the base and stared up with those flat, unblinking amber eyes. Not a blink. Not a twitch. Just a pure, undiluted stare, as if to say, "You are about to ruin your life. Carry on." "Thanks, Leonard," I said, and climbed up. The attic was exactly as I'd left it 6 months ago, which is to say it was a graveyard of things I couldn't throw away but also couldn't look at. There was my daughter Sophie's crib. The one I kept telling myself I'd sell. There were 3 boxes of tax returns from years I didn't want to remember. There was the broken treadmill I'd bought in a January surge of optimism and abandoned by February with the quiet resignation of a woman returning a library book she'd never opened. The label maker was somewhere in the box marked, "Misc. Do not open." Which was, of course, exactly the box I opened. And there, nestled between a dead 9-volt battery and a photograph of me at a company picnic in 2019, where I appeared to be laughing but was almost certainly crying. There it was. A cassette tape. Not just any cassette tape. The cassette tape. The one with the slightly wobbly handwriting on the label. The blue ink that had faded to something closer to gray. The little heart someone had drawn next to the letter M. The heart was clumsy and lopsided. The kind of heart a 17-year-old boy draws at 2 a.m. when he's trying very hard to be romantic and not quite pulling it off. The letter M stood for Maggie. The boy was Danny Kowalski. I sat down on the attic floor, which, I should note, is not a comfortable surface for existential moments, and held the tape in my hands for a very long time. Chapter 2. The Problem with the Past. Here is what I remember about Danny Kowalski. He had hair that did a thing in the front, a laugh that came out too loud and too fast, and a Honda Civic that smelled like pine air freshener and regret. He was not, by any objective measure, a great boyfriend. He forgot my birthday once, though he cried about it later, which almost made up for it. He had a habit of saying, "I'll call you tonight," and then not calling, which in 1985 meant you sat by the phone like a fool, because there was nowhere else for the call to go. But the mixtape. God, the mixtape. In 1985, making someone a mixtape was an act of almost unbearable vulnerability. You had to sit in front of a stereo system, press record, and choose, one song at a time, exactly the right sequence of feelings to hand to another person. There was no algorithm. No shuffle button. No suggested listening playlist curated by a computer that had never been in love. You chose each song yourself. And every choice said something about you that you couldn't take back. Danny had given me this tape at the end of junior year. I'd listened to it approximately 900 times that summer. Then senior year happened, and college applications happened, and we happened. The slow, quiet way that good things sometimes end. Not with a fight but with a gradual loosening, like a sweater you keep meaning to mend but never do. I hadn't thought about Danny Kowalski in years. Maybe decades. The mind does that. It files certain people away in deep storage. Not because they didn't matter, but because mattering too much is exhausting. And now here I was, 55 years old, sitting on a dusty attic floor, holding 36 minutes of someone else's heart in my hand. I did what any reasonable adult woman would do. I burst into tears, laughed at myself for bursting into tears, and then went downstairs to find out if I still owned a cassette player. Chapter 3. The Great Cassette Player Expedition. I did not own a cassette player. Of course I didn't own a cassette player. I hadn't owned a cassette player since approximately 2003, when I donated my last one to a Goodwill along with a collection of tapes I'd already stopped listening to. The irony of this. That I'd kept this tape but thrown away the means to play it. Was not lost on me. It was, in fact, very much found on me. Sophie, my daughter, was the first person I called. Sophie is 31, works in tech in Austin, and has the particular energy of someone who has never once in her life needed to rewind anything. Mom, what's a cassette player? Sophie. I mean, I know what it is. Do people still have them? Apparently not. Have you tried Amazon? I had not tried Amazon. I tried Amazon. Amazon, as it turned out, did have cassette players. Mostly sold by small companies with names like Retrosonic and Nostalgia Audio, which sounded like they'd been invented by someone who'd watched too many YouTube videos about the 1980s. I ordered one. It arrived in 2 days. It was bright orange and slightly too large for my hand, and it felt like holding a small, sad appliance from a museum nobody visits. I set it on the kitchen table. I looked at the tape. The tape looked back at me. I did not press play. Not yet. Instead. And I recognize this is an absurd thing to do, but I have been an absurd person for most of my life. I Googled Danny Kowalski. Chapter 4. The internet knows everything. Almost. Here is the thing about Googling someone you once loved when you are 55. The internet will give you everything except the one thing you actually want. There were 47 Danny Kowalskis in the world. Or at least 47 with some kind of digital footprint. There was a Danny Kowalski who was a chiropractor in Milwaukee. A Danny Kowalski who appeared to coach youth soccer in suburban Ohio. A Danny Kowalski who had once written a letter to the editor of a newspaper in Tucson about the proper way to store firewood. This last one seemed unlikely to be my Danny, but you never know. People change. What I was looking for was a Danny Kowalski from Millbrook, Connecticut. The one who'd been tall and slightly ungainly. Who'd played guitar badly and with great enthusiasm. Who'd once told me I had the kind of laugh that makes a room forget what it was doing. I found him on the 3rd page of search results, which felt appropriately dramatic. He had a website. Not a personal blog or anything so intimate. It was a professional site, clean and simple, for a small music school called Kowalski and Keys, in a town called Linden Falls, about 2 hours from where I lived. The About page had a photograph. It was unmistakably him, or rather, it was unmistakably the man who had once been the boy who drew lopsided hearts on cassette tapes. Older, obviously. Gray at the temples. A little broader in the face. But the eyes were the same. That slightly surprised look, as though he was perpetually just about to laugh at something nobody else had noticed. I stared at the photograph for approximately 4 minutes. Then I closed the laptop, made myself a cup of tea, and pretended I hadn't just spent the better part of an hour stalking a man I hadn't spoken to in 38 years. Leonard, who had migrated to the kitchen at some point, sat on the counter and stared at me with what I can only describe as profound disappointment. "I know," I said. "I know." Chapter 5. Play. I played the tape on a Wednesday. I'd been putting it off. Not out of fear, exactly, but out of something adjacent to it. Something closer to reverence, or maybe just the old instinct that some things deserve to be approached slowly. The way you approach a room where someone is sleeping. You don't burst in. You ease the door open. I sat in my living room with a cup of coffee and the orange cassette player and the tape, and I pressed play. The first song was "Don't You Forget About Me" by Simple Minds. Of course it was. I laughed out loud. A real laugh, the kind that startles you. Because it was so perfectly, painfully on the nose that it circled all the way back around to being sincere. Danny had always been like that. Not ironic. Not clever in the way that keeps people at arm's length. Just genuinely, earnestly himself, even when being genuinely earnest was a little embarrassing. The second song was "Take On Me" by a-ha, which felt less like a romantic gesture and more like Danny just really liked that song. The third was something by The Cure that I didn't recognize, slower and sadder, and I sat with it and let the feeling wash over me like water over a stone. Song after song, I listened. And something strange began to happen. I didn't just remember Danny. I remembered me. Not the Maggie of last Tuesday, the one who commuted to an office in beige and ate lunch alone at her desk reading HR policy updates. Not the Maggie of 10 years ago, going through a divorce she'd seen coming from miles away but hadn't known how to stop. Not even the Maggie of 20 years ago, still trying to be what everyone expected. I remembered the Maggie of 1985. The one who wore her hair too big and her jeans too tight and didn't care about either. The one who laughed at things that weren't funny and stayed up until 3 a.m. talking about nothing and everything. The one who had once, on a dare, sung karaoke at a bar in New Haven and was so terrible and so joyful about it that the entire room had applauded. That Maggie. The one I'd misplaced somewhere along the way. By the time the tape clicked to a stop, my coffee was cold and my cheeks were wet and Leonard was sitting in front of me with an expression that, for once, almost looked sympathetic. "Okay," I said to the room, to Leonard, to nobody. "Okay." Chapter 6. The Ridiculous Plan. The plan was ridiculous. I want that on the record. I was going to track down every song on the mixtape. I was going to listen to each one. Really listen, the way Danny had intended. And I was going to figure out what the tape was actually telling me. Not just about him, or about us, but about the version of myself I'd apparently been slowly erasing for the better part of 3 decades. And then, because the plan needed one final, certifiably insane ingredient, I was going to find Danny Kowalski and thank him. In person. Like a human being. Not a Facebook message, not an email, not a carefully worded text that I'd rewrite 17 times. An actual, face-to-face. "Hello, it has been nearly 4 decades and I have questions." Conversation. Sophie, when I told her, was quiet for a long time. "Mom," she said finally. "Are you having a breakdown?" "Possibly," I said. "But I think it might be a good one." That's actually kind of inspiring. "Don't tell your father. Dad doesn't know what a cassette tape is either, Mom." Fair point. I made a list. The tape had 14 songs. 7 on each side. Some I recognized immediately. Others I had to hunt for, cross-referencing the faint track listings Danny had written on the inside of the case in his cramped, enthusiastic handwriting. A few were scratched out and rewritten, as though he'd changed his mind mid-playlist, which felt so him that it made my chest ache. I spent the next week listening. Not just background listening, not music while I fold laundry, listening. Real listening. Headphones on, eyes closed, sitting in the good chair by the window where the afternoon light comes in gold and warm. I listened to each song the way you'd read a letter from someone you'd loved. Carefully. Slowly. Paying attention to every word. And song by song, something in me began to crack open. Chapter 7. The afternoon I called in sick. Song number 8 was Everybody Wants to Rule the World by Tears for Fears. I was listening to it on a Friday afternoon at my desk at Hartwell & Associates, where I have worked in human resources for 11 years. When something happened that I can only describe as a small, internal earthquake. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just a quiet, fundamental shift, like a bone settling back into its socket after being slightly out of place for a very long time. The song was playing in my earbuds, and I was staring at my computer screen, which displayed a spreadsheet about employee retention metrics, and I thought, I don't want this. Not the song. The song was lovely. I meant the spreadsheet. The office. The fluorescent light. The slow, careful dismantling of everything I'd once wanted to be, done so gradually I hadn't even noticed it happening. I closed the laptop. I picked up my phone. I called my supervisor, Linda, and told her I had a migraine. Which was not entirely a lie, because I did feel a pressure building behind my eyes, though it was less a migraine and more the physical sensation of realizing you've been sleepwalking through your own life. I drove home. I put on the tape. I sat in the good chair. And I cried. Not sad crying. Or not entirely. It was the kind of crying that happens when something long buried finally gets permission to breathe. Leonard came and sat on my lap, which he had never done before in the history of our relationship. I chose to interpret this as a sign. Chapter 8. Linden Falls. I drove to Linden Falls on a Saturday in late October, when the leaves were doing that ridiculous thing where they turn every possible shade of orange and gold, as if the entire landscape had decided to show off. Kowalski and Keys was on a small main street, wedged between a bakery called The Daily Bread and a hardware store that looked like it had been there since the Revolutionary War. The music school itself was modest. A converted storefront with a hand-painted sign and a window display of children's drawings. A chalkboard out front advertised lessons in guitar, piano, and what appeared to be, optimistically, the ukulele. I sat in my car for 12 minutes before going inside. I know it was 12 minutes because I watched the clock on my dashboard with the focus of someone defusing a bomb. The bell above the door chimed when I walked in. The reception area smelled like old wood and rosin and, faintly, like someone had been eating a sandwich. Behind a small desk sat a teenage girl with purple hair and an expression of magnificent boredom. "Hi," I said. "I'm looking for Danny." "Danny Kowalski?" "He's teaching," she said, not looking up. "Should be done in 20. I don't have an appointment." Now she looked up. She had the kind of face that made you feel, instantly, that she had seen everything and been impressed by none of it. "Name?" "Maggie. Maggie Callahan." She wrote it down on a sticky note, stuck it to a mug on the desk, and went back to her phone. I stood in the reception area, feeling suddenly and completely ridiculous, and wondered if this was what the rest of my life was going to feel like. A series of moments in which I was desperately out of my depth and unable to leave. 22 minutes later, a door at the back of the hall opened, and Danny Kowalski walked out. Chapter 9. The Man Behind the Mixtape. He saw the sticky note first. "Read my name." Looked up. And his face did something I will never forget as long as I live. It didn't freeze, the way people's faces freeze when they see a ghost. It didn't crumple, The way it does in movies when someone is overwhelmed. It just opened. Like a window being thrown wide in a room that had been closed for too long. His eyebrows went up. His mouth went slightly sideways. And then he smiled. And it was the same smile, the exact same smile. The one that had made me feel, at 17, like I was the most interesting thing in any room. Maggie Callahan, he said. Good God. Hi, Danny. You look. He stopped. Started again. You look exactly like yourself. I laughed. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in years. He led me to a small break room in the back. A kettle, 2 chipped mugs, a poster on the wall advertising a folk festival from 2019. We sat across from each other at a table that was slightly too small for 2 adults, which meant our knees almost touched, which meant we both shifted slightly. Which meant we laughed about it, which meant the awkwardness dissolved faster than it had any right to. I told him about the tape. I told him I'd found it in the attic, that I'd listened to it, that I'd tracked down every song. I told him about the orange cassette player and the tears in the living room and the day I'd called in sick to work. He listened the way he used to listen. Completely, with his whole body slightly leaned forward. As if the words were coming from somewhere far away and he didn't want to miss a single one. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I made that tape in one night. Sat up until 4 in the morning. Kept changing the order. Kept thinking. No, this one has to come after that one, because. He shook his head. I don't even remember why anymore. But it mattered. It mattered so much. It still does, I said. And I meant it. Chapter 10. The last song. We talked for 2 hours. Maybe more. The purple-haired teenager knocked once to ask if he wanted tea, and he said yes, and she brought it in a mug shaped like a cat, and I told him about Leonard, and he told me about his own dog. A ridiculous golden retriever named Bruce. And we laughed about the fact that we had both, independently, named our pets after things that made no sense. He told me about his life. The divorce. His 2 years ago. The music school, which he'd started almost by accident, after a decade of playing in bands that went nowhere and teaching guitar in living rooms for cash. The way it had become, slowly, the thing that made him feel most like himself. That's the secret, isn't it? I said. Figuring out which version of yourself actually fits. Took me long enough, he said. You and me both. Before I left, he walked me to my car. The October light was doing its golden thing, and the main street was quiet, and for a moment it felt like we were 17 again, standing in a parking lot after a school dance, not wanting the night to end but not quite knowing what to say. Play the last song again, he said. When you get home. Listen to it one more time. Which one is it? He smiled. That smile. You'll see. I drove home through the autumn dark, the tape in my hand, Leonard waiting at the door with his usual expression of magnificent indifference. I put the tape in the player. I fast-forwarded to the end of side 2. The last song was Dancing in the Dark by Bruce Springsteen. And I listened. Really listened, the way Danny had always meant for me to. And I understood, finally, what the tape had been saying all along. Not remember this. Not go back. But something simpler, and harder, and more necessary. Wake up. Chapter 11. What I did next. Here is what I did in the weeks that followed, in no particular order of importance. I handed in my notice at Hartwell and Associates on a Monday morning. With a calm and clarity that surprised even me. Linda asked if I was sure. I said yes. She asked if I had a plan. I said not entirely, but that I had a tape, and a cat, and a feeling, and that sometimes those three things were enough to start with. I signed up for a creative writing class at the community college. Not because I wanted to be a writer. Though maybe I did, a little. But because it was the thing I'd wanted to do at 20 and hadn't done at 30 and had completely forgotten about by 40. The class met on Tuesday evenings in a room that smelled like old carpet and possibility, and there were 12 of us, all different ages, all slightly terrified, and it was the best thing I'd done in years. I called Sophie and told her about Linden Falls. She said, "Mom, that's actually amazing." Then she said, "Wait, did you date him?" And I said, "Once, a long time ago." And she said, "And now?" And I said, "Now I'm figuring out what comes next." I texted Danny. Not a long text. Just, "Listen to the last song. Thank you. For then, and for now." He texted back, about an hour later. "Anytime, Maggie. And for what it's worth. She's still in there. The girl who sang karaoke." I had not told him about the karaoke. Which meant he remembered it too. Leonard, for his part, continued to ignore me with his usual dedication. But one evening, about a week after I'd come home from Linden Falls, he came and sat on the couch next to me while I was reading. Not on my lap. Not touching me. Just nearby. Present. Acknowledging, in his own imperious way, that something had shifted in the house. I chose to interpret this as approval. Chapter 12. The Girl on the Tape. Here is the thing nobody tells you about getting older. You don't lose yourself all at once. It happens in increments. A small choice here. Take the safe job, not the exciting one. A quiet surrender there. Don't say what you're thinking, it'll cause a scene. 100 tiny compromises, each one so reasonable in the moment that you never notice. Until one day you're 55 years old and sitting in an attic and holding evidence that you used to be someone you barely recognize. The tape didn't change me. I want to be clear about that. I was already changing. Had been changing, maybe, for years, in ways I hadn't let myself see. The tape just gave me a reason to look. Danny's mixtape was never about Danny, not really. It was about the girl who'd listened to it. The girl who'd sat on her bed in the dark with the volume turned up, feeling every song like a heartbeat, believing. With the fierce, stupid certainty that only 17-year-olds can muster. That the world was big and strange and worth paying attention to. That girl hadn't disappeared. She'd just gotten very, very quiet. The tape was a letter to her. Across the years, across the distance, across all the careful, sensible choices that had slowly buried her under layers of obligation and routine. It was a letter that said, "I see you. I hear you. You're still here." I keep the tape on my bedside table now, next to a glass of water and a library book I'm reading too slowly. I don't play it every night. But sometimes, on the hard nights. The ones where the old weight settles back onto my shoulders and the world feels small and gray. I put it in the player and I listen. And somewhere, under all the years and the quiet and the accumulated weight of being a grown-up, that girl wakes up. She stretches. She laughs. She's still in there. Epilogue. A note about Leonard. Leonard died the following spring, peacefully, on a sunny afternoon, in a patch of light on the kitchen floor. He was 14, which is a good age for a cat who has spent his entire life communicating primarily through silence and disdain. At his funeral, which was, admittedly, just me and Sophie in the backyard with a small shovel and a cup of tea, Sophie asked me if I was okay. "Yeah," I said. "I think I am." He was a weird cat. He was the weirdest cat. But you loved him. I did, I said. And I think, in his own way, he loved me back. Especially at the end. Sophie squeezed my hand. The sun was warm. Somewhere, a bird was singing something that sounded, if you were feeling generous, a little like a song you might put on a mixtape. I closed my eyes and listened.